All right, we're going to get started here. First, hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Knobel, and I'm one of the co-presidents of the Midwest United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Team Committee.
I'm Cooper Wallman. I'm also one of the co-presidents of the committee.
I'd like to begin by saying thank you so much for joining us today. I'd also like to extend another huge thank you to our diligent leader, Michelle Leone, and the entire team committee for making this event possible. Just a few housekeeping rules. We recommend you select speaker view. You can do that in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. And please use the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen to type in your questions at any time throughout the program. There will be some Q&As, and that's how we'll get your questions, just through that chat feature.
For the past 5 years, Stephen and I have worked closely with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Midwest Team Committee. Being involved has allowed us to turn our passion into action. Over the years, we have helped plan numerous interactive events and eye-opening experiences that engage Illinois teens in Holocaust and genocide education.
We plan these events along with our committee leaders and members because as teens, we know that today's youth are tomorrow's leaders. We also understand the importance of remembering the atrocities of the past to better our future and work to spread the message, never forget. We're so thankful to be joined here today by film archivist Lindsay Zarwell. Lindsay has worked with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for almost 22 years. Her work truly exemplifies the message of never forget as she preserves footage from the darkest days in our history. Today, Lindsay will give you an exclusive look at 2 or possibly even 3 of her most powerful and inspiring films. Each film will then be followed by a short question and answer session.
Finally, before we hand it over to Lindsay, we just want to remind everyone of the Team Committee's April fundraiser. For the past 18 days, members of the Midwest USHMM Team Committee have been hard at work raising money in support of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. If you've already donated, thank you so much for your support and generosity. Our goal as a committee is to raise $10,000 by the end of the month of April. We are currently just about halfway to meeting our goal. If you've not yet donated, we ask that you consider supporting the fundraiser and the museum's mission of dismantling hate and remembering the past. To donate, please click the link in the chat below.
Again, reminder, the Q&A session will all be through the chat. So at any time, if you come up with a question, please use that chat feature. Just send it to everyone in the chat and we'll make sure that we get to as many questions as possible during that Q&A time. Thank you again for joining us today. Now let's give a warm welcome and applause to our guest speaker, Lindsay Zarwell.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you all today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, does everyone see that? You can just say yes. Oh, I like the thumbs up. Thank you. All right. Okay, so thanks everyone. I'm really delighted to be here today to share stories from the Film Archive. I'm going to dive right into discussing the museum's extraordinary collections of private films. Private handheld cameras were almost everywhere and witnessed almost everything, even in the 1930s and 1940s. Cameras, which can be considered extensions of your hands and your eyes, often make fluid and intimate records of daily life. Almost every single amateur film is unique and unduplicated because it tells an individual story. The well-known archivist activist Rick Pralinger suggests, quote, "You don't know the people on the screen, but they are somehow familiar. Their work, their vacations, their celebrations, their everyday comings and goings familiar to anyone acquainted with life in the 20th or 21st century. Sometimes those behind the lens are a part of the communities they are recording. Scenes can be technically filmed well with elaborate titling, or sometimes not. There are dark shots and pretty dizzying perspectives. But as opposed to official coverage that you can find in newsreels or state-produced works, home movies present unexpected and unwanted views and often glimpses of the other. So home movies provide pretty critical documentation for the Holocaust period, and they especially resonate with viewers like you and me, as the larger history of the Holocaust can be overwhelming and monolithic. The Holocaust Museum holds approximately 180 amateur film collections. So numbers are kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but that's a really significantly high number of small private movie collections from this pretty short period in history, 12 to 15-year period in history. These films are all made by ordinary men and women like you and me. The materials can be in both black and white and in color. And it's very easy when watching private films like this for all of us to make connections, making this really dark past seem a little bit less distant. So today you'll have a chance to engage with the medium of film and possibly call into question what you see. First, I'm going to share 3 of my favorite private films from the archive, and then we'll go through to do some together. So let's go ahead and start with Robert Gessner, whose beautiful 16mm black and white films, along with over 100 photographs, are the product of a personal quest to document European Jews in the face of rising anti-Semitism in 1934. So at the age of 26, Gessner secured transit visas for journey to Europe and then to Russia and the Middle East. He arrived in England on July 11th, 1934, and traveled for many months studying and documenting Jewish communities across the world to, in his words, quote, examine the storm, the clouds of which were already gathering over America. Under my berth, I had a folding tripod and a small motion picture camera, a high precision camera that took postage stamp pictures, which could be blown up into posters, my typewriter, and suitcases full of films and books and clothes. I set out alone, seeking the songs of exile, the Hebrew melodies of pain, hope, ecstasy, remorse. I was going to see a people I had read about, but actually knew little about. So as you can see here, there are really rare images of Jewish life in 1934, in pre-war Berlin, Paris, Vienna, Vilnius, Moscow, and Palestine. So there are some really important moments in the films, but these include coverage of several synagogues that were later destroyed. You can see children at a communist summer camp at a seaside resort in France. There's the funeral of an Austrian chancellor who was assassinated by the Nazis. And you also see Jews praying during Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year in Moscow. Much of the film, if you can tell here, is actually was really compromised when we received it. It was really badly shrunken. It was suffering from vinegar syndrome, and some of the reels were even fused completely together like hockey pucks when we received the collection in 2014. The preservation was completed by a local lab, and they had to carefully unwind films off of the production reels by hand, and the films themselves were recovered through a replasticization process that lasted 6 to 8 months. And then at that point, the frames were digitized. That's what you're seeing here. Gessner filmed in 1934 extended scenes with street signs and business names that enabled us as a staff to pinpoint exact locations and the fates of Jews who had lived and worked in these areas. We're still uncovering some of those locations. So for example, last summer, a filmmaker was able to identify the Great Synagogue in Vilnius, which we don't have in any other moving image footage, as well as the Moscow Choral Synagogue. So Robert Gessner came back to the US about half a year later in January of 1935, and then he published a book that he called, quote, Some of My Best Friends Are Jews, in which he directly addressed the problem of anti-Semitism, and he was explicitly warning people in America of the Nazi threat. So one reason why we explicitly collect amateur films like Gessner's is to reunite the unique and particular stories of Jews with the images they themselves filmed. We're also able to restore individuality and bring life back to places of death. So the next piece of footage is color film, as you can see, that was taken by Dr. Benjamin Gessel, who is actually a Chicago area pediatrician. who went on holiday with his wife in 1939 to Europe. And to record his vacation, he took along his cherished 16mm film camera. And because he was a film enthusiast who was fascinated with people and wanted to catch them unaware, he insisted that his movies be in color, and he was really proud of that. So this film that you're looking at now, which is in Kodachrome, shows the Warsaw Jewish Quarter in June or July of 1939. That's only weeks before the Nazis invaded the city with such devastating consequences for the Jews of Poland. Dr. Gessel's daughter says that her dad wanted to visit this historic Jewish quarter of Warsaw to see how Jews were living there. He felt like part of filming this community would be to reconnect with the roots that he had in Riga. So his family was from Latvia. This is a pretty short sequence from a complete reel of film that really documents other touristy sites, really, of the vacation that they had in Europe. So for example, you see scenes of the famous Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and then sort of the journey that they returned to America on a boat. Okay, so lastly, before we get on to some examples that we can do together, I'd like you to consider the motivations of the individuals behind the lens. So thinking a little bit more about what is the role of the camera person. And here in this example, I want you to think about who you think may have captured this film. Why was it created? What story were they trying to tell? Who are these people? And what is their fate? And we'll see another sequence from this same film. And I will tell you that we're now in the Jewish neighborhood of Krakow in 1940. So a year after the last film, but still before the ghetto was formed in Krakow. I'll play it again, just so you have a sense, so you can think a little bit more about what I will tell you in just a few seconds about who was filming this. So this is a sequence that appears at the very tail end of a 16mm film that mostly documents personal life and business activities of the highest Nazi official in Poland, who is Hans Frank. This is really interesting film for us in the archive, of course, because it's documenting people that we don't actually have any other color film like this. That's right before the ghetto was established in Krakow. But you really have to think about how to contextualize these films for the public when you know that it's a Nazi that's sort of peering into this community and filming them we don't actually know for what reason, why. But I think it should raise some questions for all of you about how this film can then be used and reused and who we're actually documenting here. So just to give you a little bit around the provenance of that film, we only found it a few years ago through the American intelligence officer who had interrogated Hans Frank immediately after the war during the Nuremberg trials. So that intelligence officer's niece told us about this film reel, and eventually it made its way to be part of the archive. I tell you that also just to let you know that, of course, we're still finding new films, and don't hesitate if you or your family or your friends come across any artifacts to let me know if you discover anything, because our collection is still growing. So Stephen and Cooper, I think it's time for us to go ahead into the interactive component of this program.
Yeah, so we're gonna open it up to a question and answer session here. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll make sure that we get to as many as possible. But I'll start off with this. Lindsay, can you tell us a little bit about like the accessibility of the technology back in the 30s? I think like when we sort of think about the start of film, at least for me being, much younger, is sort of like the VHS film, camcorder in the 80s. So what was sort of the accessibility around sort of the 30s and 40s of this technology?
So you might be surprised to know that it wasn't completely inaccessible. So there were shops in cities where you could purchase a camera and where you could purchase film materials and where you could get your film developed. But you did need to have some kind of money in order to purchase this material. And you also had to have, the interest and sort of the sort of like you would call someone today who's techie and kind of wants to just try some things out. That's a little bit like the environment in which in the 1930s, how people were exposed to moving image cameras. Now, on the other hand, people on the other side of the camera may have never seen a moving image camera before, right? So a lot of the movies, maybe not so much what I just showed, but they showcase movement because they were different than a still picture camera, right? Because people are showing that these are moving pictures and people can like walk back and forth to the camera. A lot of times you see people waving, but just like continuously waving. And they get together in these sort of family portraits and they don't really understand that they're supposed to do more to show what's happening. But it wasn't completely inaccessible, but you did have to, like I said, have some kind of income and some way to get to a shop in order to continue to get the film and process the film.
In terms of audio, right? None of these films have audio, and I think we're so used to hearing stuff when we watch. And you could even make an argument that audio has taken over sort of the visual space with the rise in podcasting. So how does the lack of audio, what effect and impact does it have on these films?
Yeah, so in private films, it's very rare to have the sound on film, but there was sound on film in general. So people were in the movie theaters, for example, exposed to, of course, a feature film or a news film that had the track over it. And there definitely is a way to capture the audio, but you usually had to have separate devices. So like your movie camera would capture the picture and your sound recorder would capture the sound device. Of course, now we all have phones that do it all at the same time. But, actually, I'd love to hear from you what the lack of sound has for you, because I mean, I'm so immersed in this material. I work with it all the time, and most often it is silent and I'm accustomed to it. But I'm interested to know from your perspective, actually, what kind of impact does it have for you? And also I spoke over a lot of it. So you did have some kind of audio track.
For sure. And I think like if anyone has any of their own thoughts and perspectives, feel free to write them in the chat so others can read the perspective. Personally, for me, I think like one of the things that I've learned, I've sort of gone over the past 3 years on this journey through media and film. And one of the big things for me has been that, bad audio scares people away from films, I think, quicker than poor visuals. So not having the audio is kind of unsettling. Your narration over it really helped fill that void and that gap, because I think with the way how quickly our society moves today, we don't like to be silent. We don't like silence. So I think like sitting there in that silence with just the visual is not something we're used to. So it made for a somewhat uncomfortable experience, you could say. We have a question here in the chat that says, have you ever identified anyone in the films? So obviously you identified the filmmakers, but have there ever been anyone in the films and led to any big stories of people, reuniting?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And surprisingly enough, it does happen. And it does happen somewhat regularly, meaning that because the films, our entire film collection, as well as the rest of the museum's holdings, is available through an online catalog, people who are digging into their family past, maybe looking at for materials that document a particular shtetl or a particular town, they may come across a private film like this and actually discover their grandfather walking in the crowd. So it has happened probably most known is this experience in which a grandfather was recognized in footage in a small town in Poland called Naszelsk. There was a book published about this. So the family that had donated the film was an American family. And the grandfather who was discovered is a Michigan area family, but they had no even recollection of the camera person being in that town. And of course, that town during the Holocaust, it had pretty tragic, very small number of people survived, but there's this boy who is now, now he's in his 90s, but there's a boy who comes across the screen, and it is absolutely without question the same person. For him, it was able to actually really bring life and these memories back for him of a place that really was just so dark and filled with loss, right? Because nearly every person in his family had died.
You talk about that loss, and in the question we have in the chat, we have someone asking about sort of the difference between, in some videos you see smiles and others you see a more sad look. Did the Jews in these communities sort of know what was coming and sort of what was in their near future?
So without question, in the second and third example, there was definitely an awareness of what was coming, for sure. In the second film, it's right before the Nazis had come and invaded Poland, but I think sort of the writing was on the wall, certainly at that point. Whether or not people had any ability to take any action to find a way out, that's a whole nother story. But and in the last example, they were already essentially, it was already Nazi times, and the ghetto proper hadn't been established, but you saw armbands. So there was already plenty of laws in place that were making it really difficult for Jews to live normal lives. In the first example, so that's like 1934, it's unlikely that people really knew what was going to be happening 5 years later.
We have someone asking about the timeline of these films in terms of how many you're getting from earlier before sort of the Nazi regime takes over versus later. So can you tell us a little bit about sort of if there is a decline in footage from when, the Nazi regime really takes over and starts setting up those concentration camps?
Yeah, for sure, for certain, it was not as easy to record publicly and openly during the Nazi time and after. And many of the home movies and family films that we have come from before the war and were somehow safeguarded, stored with a neighbor, or families were able to get out, and then they're safe because they're in a place that wasn't disturbed by war. So if a family was able to escape and came to America already, this footage is pristine and in pretty good condition. But if a family, let's say, didn't make it out and their family was stored in the Netherlands, that itself has its own story. The actual physical object has its own story of survival in addition to the family themselves. We do have materials that were shot during the war. Of course, not everything that we have is taken from a Jewish perspective or from the victim perspective. So there are plenty of materials that exist during the war and even after. So not only liberation, but you think about displaced person camps and establishing, returning to life in other places. We do have more, the larger percentage of family materials does cover the pre-war period.
And then the last question before we move on and watch a few more films is sort of the importance of the candid nature. You talked about the second filmmaker who was really interested in capturing people at sort of their, I don't want to say most vulnerable per se, but their more sort of candid state, their unaware state. Why is that so important for people to see that and understand that during this time?
Well, I think it really shows us on the other side, sort of a human factor, right? People aren't performing more or less, right? They're just living ordinary daily lives. And I think this history from sort of the ground up is really important, right? We're not, there are plenty of films that document what the government wants to tell you is happening, or what the news media is telling you what's happening, what even propaganda is showcasing is happening. But this is kind of normal. This is every day. And I think that that is why it's really important that we are able to represent and sort of provide nuance to sort of the official perspective of the experience of this history.
So I see some more questions in the chat, but we want to keep going, show you guys some more examples of Lindsay's work in the films that she's done, but we will get to your questions in the second Q&A session. So we will have another Q&A session. If any questions come to mind while Lindsay's showing her second set of films, please write them in the chat. We will get to as many as possible. So yeah, let's keep moving on with the program. I hope you guys are learning something and enjoying it so far.
Okay, I'm just opening up another window. Let's see. Hold on just a second. All right. I'm in the middle though. Okay, we'll start again. Here we are. So just so you know, this is just to give you a tiny little bit of context. This is a really short glimpse of an 8mm color film by an American family who was visiting Poland and many other places in Europe in 1937. So it's a whole family, including 2 daughters, Judith and Belle, and the father, Jacob, and a wife, and I don't actually have her name here. But at this point in the film, they're going to visit their family, which is in Wola, Poland, which is a really small place. So I think what I want you all to think about, and is sort of everyone on the call, if you will, are what are your impressions of what you see here? What do you see and what don't you see? What's missing? And maybe you could type some of these thoughts already into the chat. Okay, I'm going to play it. Oh, it looks like it's playing already on its own one more time. Okay. I'm not sure if anything came up in the chat. Okay, let's see. Do we have any thoughts about what we're looking at here? Or do you want me to tell you a little bit more about what you're seeing or what you had seen?
Tell us a little bit more about sort of this film and the history behind it.
Okay. Okay, so the Hertz family took this trip in 1937. They put their car in the steerage of the boat. And the 2 older women that you saw there, one woman was Belle, another woman, the kids, that is Belle, and the sister's name, of course, I have it here and I can't see it. Well, Judith. Judith is her sister's name. So Judith and Belle Moser went with their parents. Judith actually kept a diary the entire time, but they recall that their father literally took a ruler onto a map that went from Paris to Poland. And they realized at the time that they got there that it went straight through Germany, and they'd have to actually travel through this place where there was discrimination against Jews at the time. But they didn't really think about the extent of what they would experience before they went there. Their father took film in both black and white and in color, and he saved his color film for this family reunion that you saw here, which is in Wola, Poland, where his father, who was in the middle there waving, Israel, he greeted the Americans at the time, with a newly built outhouse so that they would have a comfortable place to use the bathroom, because that was not a common theme or any common occurrence in this place in Poland. So unfortunately, what we come to learn is that their father, who they had tried to bring back to America, kind of refused to come, and he later was unable to climb into a wagon that was used to deport the rest of his family to Auschwitz, and they actually, all of them perished. But what's really important for us to see here is them before, right? Life before in this very small town in Poland. So I hope that explains a little bit more about that particular film.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things that you discussed with sort of Cooper and I before the event was that sort of difference of black and white versus color. Could you talk about that impact and also the accessibility of color film during that time in history?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, what I've heard and probably what you all have seen is mostly that the history of the Holocaust is presented in black and white. I don't know if anyone on this call has even seen much color material from the period. But as you can see by these examples, there was quite a bit of color film. It was completely accessible. And in fact, it was much better made because it was pretty early on in the development of color film. It was better made, which means it's lasted better over the course of time. And we can preserve and restore the colors as they were shot, right? So later in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the color process technically used kind of cheaper chemicals, and they didn't last as long. So, but for me, I think it makes actually this history seem much more real when you see it in color than when you do in black and white, right? And I don't know, you get a sense of patterns and fashion on clothing. You get a sense of like trees blossoming, and I just think it makes it more real. There's still quite a hesitation in the field. So in filmmakers and scholars today often still like to use black and white materials, even though there's a lot of color out there available. They still like to reuse black and white materials to illustrate this period. I'm sure you've seen tons of documentaries and even news coverage, for example, of this past month, the Holocaust anniversary events or commemoration events, and oftentimes any news program will really only show black and white footage.
I know that there's the technology. Sorry, Cooper, I just want to ask one more question. I know that there's the technology to restore the color for films today. Is there any sort of restoration of color being done? Is that something that people have expressed they want to do? Because I know you expressed a lot of filmmakers liking sort of the black and white and what that brings to the history.
I think you might be talking about colorizing, maybe. Which is sort of like if anyone saw Peter Jackson's film from World War I that had this really effect of taking all the black and white footage of World War I and actually sort of putting color into artistically. So we do get requests from filmmakers to do that with black and white materials, and we often don't approve it simply because there is already color material that exists, so why not use that? Artistically, it's just not a position that the museum itself is in. But in terms of actual restoring or rescuing like original color, or even original films that may have deteriorated, and we try to sort of not reconstruct it, but repair it. We do that. We always make sort of an archival representation available, and then sort of the improved version. If that makes sense.
I know that you have more films and more examples for us, but I think there's a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to throw it over to Cooper for some more Q&A time, if that's all right.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a couple of chat questions. What was the experience for them to realize, the filmmakers and families who donated the films? What was the experience for them to realize that at one time they were just a family of vacation footage that became memorials of those who who were killed in the Holocaust, and like what was the family's reaction basically to understanding that this was the only record that they had of their family who perished?
In the last example, I mean, it really varies. It varies by individual collection. I would say 9 times out of 10, many people who have materials in their possession are interested in having the memories of those families and individuals, those collections preserved, but they don't really sort of translate that by doing that, by depositing their original materials in an archive like at the Holocaust Museum, and in essence preserving that story, that they are able to introduce those stories to many other people, right? So to scholars, to students like you all, to the public, to genealogists, to many other people, we're able to actually share that story wider. And so many families are not really fully aware of what their own personal documentation does for the historical record, in providing sort of variation, individuality, and sort of understanding of really the daily life experiences. I mean, for us, it's crucial, it's amazing, and we're finding rare stuff literally all the time. It's hard to communicate that to a family, actually. It is.
Sure. I just have another question from me, not from the chat. You said that this was an American family visiting their ancestors in Poland. I was just wondering what the role of cameras was at that time in America, and the ease of getting a camera in America was. And like, also like just going back to the first video, I know this is a double-sided question. I feel like it sort of captures like the innocence of people as well. And it's sort of interesting that it can be used for good or bad. And I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of camera availability, in cities, in urban places, the cameras were much more accessible. And that this American family could bring with them a camera and the equipment. And I guess what's probably not obviously stated here is that we are sort of in this position as an American Holocaust institution to be able to collect American movies. So Americans who had come over here, you know, who had family back, but were basically tourists, right? And actually took snapshots of places and people and time that do preserve those images. It's a little bit different if you think about Holocaust organizations or repositories that are in Europe, because what could last, what lasted, right? Not much. So we are really in this sort of unique American position to be able to collect a lot of movies. But there were plenty of amateur film enthusiasts all across the world. Like, so Budapest, for example, Prague, Vienna, they all had sort of amateur clubs, and both mostly men, but also women would kind of get together and they would have, you know, buy cameras and buy films and have exercises and meet up and show each other their films. So there were even like journal publications. They had their own sort of title cards. If I had more time, I'd be happily to show you these things. So people making their own intertitles and creating their own even comedy films. We have examples like that in our collection. And again, I will sort of emphasize for everyone on the call, these are male makers and women makers, which was very rare, but did happen. And it's really kind of, it was a cool thing to do. It was a cool craft, just as much as you guys are maybe into, you know, movie making on a device. That's exactly what type of people it attracted, the creating of movies.
Also, just another question from the chat. Were the videos ever used to prosecute Nazis, or used as evidence, or just used to like document injustices in general during the Holocaust?
Yeah, so nothing that I'm showing you today was used, but the Nuremberg trials, which were immediately after the war, in which tried sort of the highest Nazi officials. Not only was documentary meaning paper documents, used sort of to to convict these people, but they did use pictorial evidence and film evidence that was captured mostly from an official perspective. So in terms of private films, there weren't very many that were utilized to actually hold Nazis accountable, but there was lots of coverage of the liberation of concentration camps, for example, showing the extent of Nazi atrocities, and those were compiled into films that you can access through a website called Nazi Concentration Camps and the Nazi Plan. So absolutely, they were moving image evidence was used.
Awesome.
I have a quick question. Just to sort of expand on the idea of the films being used in like a trial or a court of law, how are these films and how is your work influencing other aspects of research and restoration of this period in history? How are other organizations using your films to uncover the past?
Well, I mean, I think everything that we collect at USHMM, our work is to sort of document this period. We serve thousands of different kinds of researchers every year. So meaning they could be scholars, they could be filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, news media, it could be exhibition curators, or even like you're saying, attorneys who are trying to put together cases. It's a really wide range of audience, if you will, that we have for all of these materials. We do some of our, archivists or curators might do some of our own outreach. The museum has our own sort of programs, but the whole purpose of actually what I do is to collect these materials, to preserve them, and really the primary emphasis, especially at USHMM, is to make them accessible, and accessible not only by visiting in person the museum, but accessible online. So our online catalog collection search is really sort of the platform, the space for anyone to try to find materials as it relates, historical materials as they relate to this period. And so I will sort of plug that if you're doing any sort of projects or interest in any research, or you actually are interested in trying to assist our sort of descriptive efforts, I'd be happy to hear from any of you who are interested in, even if you have language abilities, you're interested in like translation work. We have millions of collections at USHMM, and collections.ushmm.org, I'll plug it in the chat here, is really the best spot for everyone to look to find materials.
One more chat question before we throw it back to you. Were the videos, or like private videos, were they more like plentiful in Europe, or like would you have to travel to places to recover them, or would they be passed generationally? Like, we just know a little bit more about that.
So we can travel. We do travel usually in normal times. We're usually traveling, to Europe, but also to South America to collect materials. We also work with, so sort of to answer your question, there were amateur films and home movies that are created sort of everywhere, but where they live right now is really all across the world, right? Because anyone could have traveled anywhere. And so we get collections literally from all over the world, including Israel. And you may know, of course, like we have partners at Yad Vashem, and there are other really big Holocaust organizations, and we don't sort of duke it out about who's getting what collection. Our goal now is to really partner together to rescue materials. So we'll work together jointly to preserve collections, and then to make them accessible through Yad Vashem's site, as well as through USHMM's site, so that more people can access this material.
Just one more thing before we show some more examples of your films. I'm curious how COVID-19 has impacted your industry, because typically we think of like film as, a more digital industry now than it used to be, because everything's on SD cards, everything can be shared through files online, through the cloud. But the film that you're recovering is physical film, 16 millimeter or whatever it may be. So how has COVID-19 impacted your industry and your work as an archivist?
So it's a great question, right? So I'm not working in the museum is closed, our vaults are closed. So any kind of collections that we have on site that we're trying to digitize and make accessible, all of that work has stopped. However, the laboratories that do this that do this technical work, they're all open, right? And so there is an ability for folks to be able to rescue and actually hand work on materials. So if we could get films in the door, we would be able to continue to work on films. I do also want to tell you that, yes, absolutely, you're talking about file sharing, which is what we do all the time. If someone has preserved a film or digitized a film and lives in another country or another state, for example, and all they have to do is send me a digital file, that's great. I'm still actually able to add their film to our collection. And eventually, when we do open our doors, the physical reel will come into our vaults as well. But right now, we can at least kind of get started. So in terms of, we're still collecting, and over this past year, probably added a dozen new film collections, digital only right now, but eventually we'll get the film materials as well.
One last chat question. How did people whose families had taken the videos, how did they like physically find them? Like, were they cleaning out basements? Like where were they stored, and like how did they come upon them?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that question because, of course, that's what a lot of people started doing at the beginning of COVID, right? Is sort of like, okay, let me clean out my basement, let me clean out my closets, and let me see what I find. So there's actually been an increase in the numbers of collections that have been presented as options for USHMM. But yeah, I mean, I'd say people do find things when they're cleaning out spaces, but there's also, some people are not ready to let their family materials go, especially if survivors are still alive. That's a link to their family, to their past, physically, tangibly. That's really difficult sometimes for people to let go of. So we respect that, of course, and we try to help people understand sort of the benefit of depositing the materials in an archive, because it'll preserve them for longer. And like I said earlier, more people can have a sense of their story. But, we totally understand when people just aren't ready. And sometimes an acquisition can take, 5 years or 10 years. So we may hear from someone, and then we just kind of keep on calling back and, building a relationship. And then one day they might be ready. They might be really ready for us to come in. And we do visit homes. Of course, we're not doing that now, but we visit with people, make trips. I hope that helps to answer that question.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. We're going to throw it back to you to show another video. Please keep linking your questions in the chat, and we'll hopefully eventually get to them.
Okay.
I do want to say we are sort of coming down to time here, so we may not have an opportunity to do another Q&A session, but we definitely want to leave you guys with another film clip.
Okay, I feel like I have 2 more, and I'm not sure. Maybe I'll ask Stephen and Cooper, do you think we should do the quorum one or the liberation one?
Let's do the quorum one. I
Okay.
thought that one was
okay.
Actually, no, let's do liberation, because I think it shows a different perspective. Let's do liberation.
Okay.
I'm coming back.
It's no worries. It's more color. So all right. So I'm gonna play it, and then I'll probably talk a little bit over it given the time that we have here. Right now you're looking at Belsen concentration camp. This is filmed by a gentleman named Charles Horton, who was part of the voluntary ambulance and truck organization known as the American Field Service. They're here assisting British forces after the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. And he himself shot this small gauge color film with a personal 8mm movie camera. And what we saw at the beginning was a large group of German SS officers, and here are some barracks, and there were some grave sites as well. And And later, the British set fire to the camp in an effort to combat typhus. But this is the only known American film coverage of the Belsen camp. And it's actually also the only film collection that's in the American Field Service archives, which is American Field Service is an organization based in New York. So here you see setting fire to the camp. So this was a joint partnership project in which we worked together. We borrowed this 8mm film from that archive, and we jointly preserved and digitized the contents and make them available in both locations. Oops. Okay, lastly, I'm just going to run through a few more slides and then we can go ahead and close out. Oh, no. Okay, there we were. Or not. Sorry. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of emphasize, I think we've already covered this a little bit, but the one reason why the museum has focused significant attention on rescuing film is because the film materials can be fragile and vulnerable to physical deterioration. And also loss of intellectual control, meaning that the materials remain in private hands, and then people are unable to tell us who is actually pictured in the films. So new film scanning technology and digital tools have really revolutionized our work, especially with compromised film. On the right here, you see as films are being digitized, the camera themselves is now really not directly in contact with the compromised film, and we're able to capture images of around the sprocket holes, which is telling us a lot more about the physical characteristics of the film. So we're preserving both the contents inside and the material itself. And okay, so this is images of our collection search catalog. And what I wanted to point out here is, in addition to sort of the gateway to our rich collections, we also provide on each catalog record page this button for recognize someone and giving feedback. And this is really our chance. You asked earlier about whether or not people are ever discovered. Well, they easily can write to us and let us know that they've found someone by just clicking this button. They can give us feedback, or they can also tell us if we have misidentified a person or a place, so they're giving us more details. So that's all. I just really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today and for you to learn a little bit more about archive films and how important a role that they play in shaping our sense of the past and our vision for the future.
Well, yeah, so we're running a bit short on time, so I know there's a huge call to watch the Quorum film as well.
Okay, but we'll do Quorum.
Yeah, let's do the Quorum as well, and then we'll sort of close it out. And remember, you can go to collections.ushmm.org to view more footage and also sort of interact with that site.
Okay. Here we are in the Philippines. In Manila. These are Jewish refugees celebrating Purim in 1940, March of 1940. So the film itself is compiled and it's titled, it was called A Children's Party. We're in Manila, which is land that was donated by the president of the Philippines just for Jewish refugees. So most of these people at this party are the German and Austrian refugees who were given visas to come to the Philippines for various work efforts. This guy with the cigar there in the center is one of the Americans who helped to get the refugees there. He and his brothers had a cigar manufacturing business in the Philippines, and they spent a lot of time in the Philippines to support the work of that factory. That gentleman with the camera around his neck is a cantor named Joseph Seisner. And this is this little, Purim performance, if you will, which was a children's production of the Book of Esther. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop it so I can go ahead and close out. It only goes on for another 30 seconds or more.
Yeah, so I just want to say, first and foremost, Lindsay, thank you so much for sharing your footage and knowledge with us all. Your work as a film archivist is really more important today than ever. As our world continues to embrace new technology, it seems that film has really become a vital medium. While your films may not have audio, the audio and visual landscapes of video help us understand the emotion and hardships connected to really these unexplainable moments in our history.
Also, again, we just want to remind everyone of the Teen Committee's April fundraiser. All the proceeds of the fundraiser are in support of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's undying mission to advance and disseminate knowledge about the Holocaust and genocide as they work to preserve the memory of those who suffered. Also, to donate, please click the link in the chat. Every dollar amount is greatly appreciated. It makes a huge difference for everything.
And now we're going to throw it over to Michelle Leone for a few last words before we part ways on this Sunday. Oh, Michelle, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Lindsay, for an incredible and fascinating program. It was a really wonderful discussion. Thank you, Stephen and Cooper and all of the teens involved in the committee for your strong leadership this year. It's been quite an unprecedented year, and each of you have worked really, really hard to come together and develop this program today, as well as the April fundraiser. We still do not know what will be in the fall, what it will look like. The museum is unfortunately not open yet, but I wanted to remind you that there are excellent online exhibitions on our website, as well as weekly Facebook Live programs. As Stephen and Cooper stated, we encourage you to donate to the Teen Committee's efforts to support public genocide education and prevent future genocides from occurring. Any donation, large or small, is appreciated. Everyone at the Midwest office and the museum truly appreciates all of your meaningful gifts. And don't forget to put on your calendar our 2021 Chicago virtual event will be on September 23rd. Thank you again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.